When Yosef introduces his brothers to Pharaoh, he wants to make sure that Pharaoh doesn't get too impressed with them and draft them into the army. And so he only introduces the weaker brothers. The question is, who are the weaker brothers? So Rashi will give us two different explanations. One from the Medrash, which he Dafka highlights is the Eretz Yisraelic way of learning, and the other from the Gemara, which is the Bavel way of learning, and then he pegs on the Sifri as well. Now, what's interesting about this is that the five he identifies over here seem to be different to the ones he identifies in V'zos HaBrocha. And also, when he talks about Shevet God, he indicates that they're from the powerful brothers, which doesn't seem to necessarily fit with at least one of the opinions over here. It's also interesting that here he gives us two opinions, and in V'zos HaBrocha he just gives us one opinion. So we have to understand who are the stronger and who are the weaker brothers, and why is it explained differently in different contexts. And of course, why is that to do with, as Rashi will tell us, the fact that Moshe mentions their name twice when he blesses them, that somehow that indicates if they're strong or weak. Ifan pasuk, so commenting on the pasuk that says, that out of his brothers, Yosef took 5 men and he presented them in front of Pharaoh. Is Rashi Mefarish? Rashi explains who, which 5, why these 5, and he says, he chose the 5 that were the weakest. That they should not appear as if the brothers are powerful individuals, and he had a reason for it. Because if Pharaoh would see that the brothers are strong, he would draft them into his army, and obviously Yosef did not want that. Now says Rashi, who are those brothers? So Rashi quotes 2 different opinions who the weak brothers were. First opinion is Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, Yisachar, Binyamin. How do we know? Because later on in V'zos HaBrocha, when Moshe blesses the different Shvatim, these Shvatim, he does not repeat their names twice. Rashi says that's an indicator that they're weak brothers. Whereas the stronger brothers, Moshe mentioned their name twice in their brachas. And then, of course, Rashi tells us who they are. Then Rashi tells us what seems to be unnecessary information. This is the way it's expressed in the Medrash, Bereshis Rabbah. And then he adds, Shehi Agodas Eretz Yisrael, which is the attitude of extrapolating Torah as they do it in Eretz Yisrael. Avol B'Gemara Bavli Shelonu, whereas if you look in the Talmud Bavli, our Gemara, why do you have to say our Gemara? He says the exact opposite. Which are the ones that Moshe doubled or repeated their names? The weaker ones. And those are the ones that he brought in front of Pharaoh. And then Rashi doesn't end there. On Firtois continues, there's a brisa quoted in the Sifri on V'zos HaBrocha, which is not our parasha, that says the same as our Gemara. Why do you have to tell me that? So there are quite a number of questions that we have to address. Namely, it's nit verstandig, it doesn't seem to make sense. Aleph, das was Rashi darf bringen von Azal, wer von die Shvatim seinen gewähnt die Chaloshim und wer die Geborim. The fact that Rashi had to tell us who are the weak and who are the strong brothers is move on. That we can understand. You got to find me a source to say who they are. Because there's nothing in the pasuk that gives us any indication which are considered the strong or the weak brothers. So you have to find that in a Medrash or in a Gemara. We get that. Question is, but who needs all the details over here to explain the pshat? The pshat is he took the weaker brothers so they don't land up in the army. Why do we have to know the arichus uprotim as dosis verbunden mit loy kofel shmoisen keshebercham oder kofel v'chulei? Why is it relevant over here to this conversation about how Yosef presented his brothers to Pharaoh here? Why is it relevant to know that later on when Moshe will bless them in V'zos HaBrocha, whether he does or doesn't repeat their names is the indicator if they're strong or weak? Why is that relevant here? Aber fratas Rashi zeichnet on sei wie sei 3 Sforim als Mocker is Haroitze Yavoy v'yireh. Rashi already gives us 3 places to look: a Medrash Rabbah, a Gemara, and a Sifri. You want the details? Go look up the sources. That Rashi often does that. He gives us the source, and that way he implies you should look further. Why does he have to fill in the details that are in those sources? Question number 1. Question number 2, Beis. Von dem, was Rashi brings 2 days Hofchis von Razal is Muchach. The fact that Rashi brings 2 contradictory opinions, either Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yisachar, Zvulun are strong or they're weak, as Yisachar, Binyamin are strong or weak. The fact that Rashi brings both implies, as in Pshutish or Mikra Dois, Nitoken Achrot Zvishon Dideos, means that there's nothing in the Pshat of the Psukim to say which opinion is correct. Says nor was in ersten Pirish is da gewisse Yisron gab dem Zweiten und darüber bringt frier. It's just that there is obviously some logical reason why the first explanation makes more sense, which would be why Rashi brings it first. Says Dov Demat Sveindika Tamia. The fact that Rashi has two different opinions, indicating that the pshat does not lend itself to one of the opinions, raises two other questions for us. Number one, Aleph. In Vayigash sagt Hashem Pharaoh, as chamisha shvatim sheberach ba'achroina, Zvulun, Gad, Dan, Naphtali, ve'Asher. In Vayigash Rashi gives one opinion, that the second set of brothers, which are not the ones he quotes over here as the weak ones, those so there in Vayigash he says that those brothers are the ones whose names are doubled or mentioned twice by Moshe Rabbeinu because they're the weak ones, so they needed to be bolstered and strengthened. And then he says over there, those are the ones that Yosef took in front of Pharaoh, quoting our pasuk. Dos haste. That means by the time you get to Vayigash Bracha, it implies as in Pshutei Shel Mikra, the pshat is Vibal de Zoktes Bestam, because Rashi just says it without saying that there are other options. They're not even saying that this is a drasha of Chazal. Is a dot machrio and vidit sveitadea. Doesn't that tell you that there in Vayigash Bracha, Rashi clarifies for us which are the weaker brothers and which one is it? The second opinion that Rashi quotes here. So why does he bring two opinions here as if there's no resolution, and in Vayigash Bracha one opinion saying that there is resolution? It's Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, and Zvulun. Second of all, in Parshas Matos Udvorim sagt Rashi bepashtus, as Shevet God is given zwischen divas Giberim hayu. In Parshas Matos and Devarim, where we talk about Ruvain and God and Chatzi Sheva Menashe, that they wanted to get the Transjordan, there Rashi says absolutely, without question, that God is one of the powerful Shvatim. Which is the opposite to what he apparently concluded in Vayigash Bracha, where he says clearly God is one of the weak ones. As al peep shutta shemikah God is given from the chaloshim. So how do you reconcile this? Which one is it? Is there no clarity, in which case Rashi brings two opinions, so then why bring a single opinion in Vayigash Bracha? And why bring contradictory opinions? In Vayigash Bracha you say God is weak, and in Dvarim Amatos you say God is strong. Now, you might want to answer, but it's not going to work. As in Yedin Fall Bazunde is Rashi Meforish Loit Viasis Muchachim Pshute Shel Mikra Al Asar. Don't even go down this road to say, you see, in Parshas Vayigash, the context lends itself to one explanation in Pshat. And in Vayigash Bracha, the context lends itself to a different explanation. And in Matos and Dvarim, a different explanation. Don't go there. On a Parshas Matos Udvorim is al pi pshut shel Muchrach hashevet God is given from the Giborim, because then you'd say, look, in Devarim and Matos the context is about who are the soldiers who are going to lead the conquest of Israel, and God is listed there, so it must be one of the powerful groups. In Vayigash Bracha muss man sagen hashevet God is given zwischen die fünf Shvatim chaloshim, whereas when you're in Vayigash Bracha and you see that God is listed together with Zvulun and Asher, Naphtali and Dan, that implies that God is one of the weaker ones. Whereas in our parasha there's no clarity. So what are you saying? That there's some kind of a pick and choose when you're explaining Pshat? You cannot say that. We've explained many times. And it's quite logical. As es kann nicht sein, as der Pirish al pi pshute shel mikra in ein Ort soll sein bestirat zum Pirish al pi pshute shel mikra in a zweiten Ort. It is ridiculous to suggest that the pshat of one pasuk is the direct contradiction to the pshat of another pasuk. Doesn't work. So we have to understand. Here Rashi seems to say there's no clarity who the weak brothers are. In Vayigash Bracha, it's clearly those five. Dan, Asher, God, Naphtali, Zvulun, and God suddenly in Vayigash Bracha is weak, and in Matos and Dvarim is strong. It doesn't seem to make sense. So the first place we'll start is we'll have a look at the difference between how Rashi has no clarity here and the way he definitely says that God is a strong shevet when we're in Matos and Dvarim. So the bir ben gedem shina and from Pirshashi do und sein Pirsh and Parshas Matos Devarim. Let's first look at that. The difference between how Rashi leaves it open-ended here and clearly says God is strong in those two parashas. Because das, was man gefindt, as in ein Ort bringt Rashi zwei Pirushim in einer zweiten Pasuk is before nur leut ein Pirush. The fact that Rashi might sometimes quote two opinions in one context and in a different context only go with one of those opinions, kann sein slip zwei svaris. There are two possible reasons why that might be. Why you first quote two opinions and then at some point you only go with one of those two opinions. Either it's Aleph Beruba Derube in most cases, Leuten gebrachten Pirish ist für eine Schwierigkeit im zweiten Pasuk bewohnt es Rashi befirushay. So it could be that I've got two commentaries. When I get to a later pasuk, one of those commentaries will clash with that pasuk, and Rashi has to clarify it. Mashenken Leuten zweiten nicht gebrachten Pirish ist der pasuk bepashtus and es freut sich nicht kein bavornish. Whereas the other opinion fits well with the pasuk, so Rashi doesn't have to explain it. So we have two versions: either these are the strong or these are the weak brothers. When I come to the pasuk of the Chalutzim going to conquer Eretz Yisrael, well, the pasuk that says strong brothers, well, God would fit with that. It makes sense. Okay, that would be one possible reason. So you don't have to bring the other explanation. Or Be'isiva Hafchis could be the exact opposite. It could be actually the exact opposite. This is the pasuk that supports one opinion. So let me quote that opinion because here it has corroboration. But it's not 100% clear because you could find a way to wiggle the other opinion in. So Rashi is going to show us why we go with that opinion. And that's actually going to be the explanation. That might be quite abstract right now. So we're going to see how that works with the story of God, and it will actually make it quite easy to understand. That's what happens over here in the story of God. When you're learning Parashas Vayigash, there's nothing in the parasha that helps us to work out who are the strong brothers and who are the weak brothers. But when you read the story of Matos and Dvorim, is mashmas b'nei God zayin given giborim. Those stories imply that God are the strong brothers. Because if they were not strong, why would they suggest we're going to lead the charge to conquer Eretz Yisrael? That would be ridiculous if you're not strong people. And even if they were delusional, and if they were delusional and they thought they were stronger than they actually were, Moshe would never have accepted their proposal. And not only does he accept it, he turns it into an instruction. You need to do this. You are required to lead the campaign. So in that passage, in our parasha Vayigash, we don't know, is God strong or is God weak? But when you read Matos and Devarim, we have evidence that God is a strong tribe. Umemele, can man nicht sagen, as das was Rashi is in first parashas Matos und Devarim, as bnei God seinen gewen geboren is a slip, der was schwetter koffer Moshe schmeißen in sein Brocha. Now, when you come across this, what do you see now? Rashi is saying, okay, we have two possibilities. God is weak, God is strong. This particular explanation suits me to say God is strong. So I'm going to quote it over here and use this pasuk as proof of the fact that God is one of the strong nations. Now, don't say, how do I know they're strong? Because later in V'zois HaBrocha, I'll have further proof. No, I'm looking now. Befratas direi von Rashi as Giborim heute ist nicht nur vom pasuk war Chalutz over lifneim. Steht in Yeshua, especially when you consider that the evidence that Rashi uses to show that God are strong is not from a pasuk later on in Yehoshua. In Asman was is noch birchas Moshe, after maybe Moshe had already given them a bracha and maybe strengthened them now. Now from the psukim in Pashas Matos and Dvorim Gufa far birchas Moshe, but dafka from these psukim in context immediately there in Matos and Dvorim, which shows that even before Moshe blessed them, they were already strong. In other words, we said one of the possibilities of why Rashi would adopt one explanation when previously he had said, I don't know which of the two to use, is because one of the explanations fits better with the story in this context, and he wants to highlight how it is dafka that approach and not the other one. So you might have thought, why is God strong? Because Moshe gives them a bracha which strengthens them. Says Rashi, no. God was always strong. How do I know? Because even before they were given the bracha by Moshe, they were already on the cards to be the forward guard, the advance guard of the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. Now that doesn't completely exclude the possibility of the other opinion Rashi used in our parasha, that maybe God is one of the weak ones, as God is given from the Chaloshim, because if it was that clear, then obviously here Rashi would have had his answer and he would have only given us one opinion. Because it's a very simple logical explanation to say the reality at the time of Yaakov's bracha and the reality at the time of the conquest of Eretz Yisrael was not the same reality. Because it's possible Kann man sagen bepasst as God ben Yaakov is taka gewen fundi chaloshim. There is the possibility that the human, the original God, who stood before Pharaoh might have been a weak person. And therefore, a good example of don't take these people into your army. Aber yoytze chalotzov, but his descendants, Anshe Shevet God 250 years better. The descendants of God's family, 250 years later, the people who are about to enter Eretz Yisrael, maybe they became strong over time. So here, Vayigash, we don't know, is God strong or not? Either one is possible. And it would not be, even if you say God is weak at this point, it's not a contradiction to the fact that his children or great-great-grandchildren turned out to be strong people. And there's a logical explanation for it. Ubefrat, as die Schwotten haben sich misschatten gewesen, eine mit die andere, hat doch gekannt sein. Because the different tribes did intermarry at that point, so it's possible. As bnei God haben sich mischatten gewesen mit bnei shvatim hagiborim. Maybe God had descendants who married into the stronger shvatim, und ihre Kinder haben gejasht die Geburt von Mishpachas Ha'im. And maybe their children had the DNA of their mother's side, and they ended up being strong. So, in the story of Matos and Dvarim, it's logical that the Bnei God are powerful people. That's why Moshe wants to put them at the front of the conquest of Israel. But here in Vayigash, that doesn't prove anything for us, because when Yosef wants to display the weakest brothers to Pharaoh, it could be that God himself is still in that category. So we can easily reconcile Parashas Vayigash and the dilemma about who the weak brothers and strong brothers are with Matos and Dvarim, where we're clear that Bnei God are strong. That's fine. Es bleibt aber nicht moving, but we still have to reconcile Vayigash and V'zois HaBrocha. And for that matter, V'zois HaBrocha with Matos and Dvarim, because in V'zois HaBrocha, God is one of the weak brothers. Vos is the mashmos in V'zois HaBrocha as divas kofel shmoisim seinen gewen chaloshim. Let's go with the view that says that in V'zois HaBrocha, those names that Moshe repeated, it's because they were weak and they needed strengthening. Which was the second opinion Rashi quoted in our parasha from the Gemara. And if, like Rashi does in V'zois HaBrocha, says this is the explanation, which implies that it's the pshat, why does Rashi not bring it as at least, if not the only opinion, the first opinion? Because it has backing from V'zois HaBrocha. And then there are a whole lot of details in the way Rashi presented his explanation that seem to be unnecessary details. Why are they there? So we have to understand Rashi's commentary in our parasha Vayigash. Number one is Mayich in Zampirish. Why does he bring so much detail? Just say simply, 5 brothers who would look weak so that Pharaoh would be dissuaded from drafting them to the army. Second of all, Beloshin Bilti Rogil Klal Bepirish Rashi. Look at the language that Rashi uses. It's so uncommon. Aleph Eretz Mosif Zel L'Shem Bereshis Rabba Shi Agadas Eretz Yisrael. Why do we have to know suddenly now in Parashas Vayigash that the Medrash Bereshis Rabba is the methodology of expounding Torah of Eretz Yisrael? And then he says Deloshin B'Gemara Bavlis Shelonu, and he compares it to the Gemara Bavlis. Now, the fact that it says Shelonu, you could answer maybe it's because there were different Girsois, maybe there were different versions around, and Rashi wants to say it's the version we have. Fine, Mela. But why do you have to say Gemara Bavlis? To say the Gemara. And lastly, Bebraisa de Sifri Shaninu Bevazei Sabracha Kamei Gemara Shelonu. So long-winded. The Braisa quoted in the Sifri on V'zoi Sabracha is like our Gemara. Number one, why do we need a proof? The Gemara already has an opinion. Why do I have to know that this opinion is also shared by the Braisa Sifri? Why do I have to know that it's a Braisa quoted in the Sifri? Just say in the Sifri. Gimel, my nafkim in tzidi Braisa in the Sifri is in V'zoi Sabracha, or they're in an under parsha. What difference does it make to us to know which parsha the Sifri is commenting on? Surely the point is to say the Sifri says like the Gemara. Leave out the Braisa, and leave out the fact that it's on V'zoi Sabracha. So the Bir B'chol Zeh, to explain all of this, we have to consider the following. We read the pasuk. The pasuk says Yosef took out of his brothers 5 of them to present to Pharaoh. And the pasuk doesn't tell us who they are. Logic says if we have 5 brothers who are distinguished from the other brothers and we're not told who they are, then somewhere else in the Torah we must find 5 brothers who are set apart from the other Shvatim, and that's where we know who they are. The Rabbi bringt Rashi the Arichos von Chazal as das verstande von Birchas Moshe. So therefore Rashi says, okay, we look through the whole Torah. What do we discover? Well, if you look in the Medrash and you look in the Gemara, it tells us that when Moshe later on is going to bless the Shvatim, he singles out 5 of them in a different way to the others. Some of the Shvatim he repeats their name, and some of the Shvatim he does not. Das ist der einzige Ort, wo man gefindt, als Torah telt uns 5 Shvatim besonder. It's the only place where the Torah names 5 Shvatim separate from the other Shvatim. Like die 2 Eifanim for die 2 Pirushim. And in one of the 2 ways. Either it highlights them by doubling their name and therefore they're weak, or doubling their name and therefore they're strong. So there's the link. Rashi has to show us that link. We don't know who are the subjects of this pasuk, so we have to look, scour the whole of Chumash, and find somewhere else where 5 brothers are highlighted. Leidach Gisa, on the other hand, despite the fact that the Torah here clearly does not list the names of the 5 weak brothers, von dem Ober, was man hat gelernt bisher, can men je wissen bepschute schon mikre wegen die Gvur und Chleshus von einige Shvatim. We might not know who the 5 weak brothers are, but we do know at least some of who the strong brothers were, based on things that we have learned before. So let's think, according to Pshat, which brothers stand out as being strong? Well, the first obviously has to be Shimon and Levi. Lernen die Parsha von Shechem. When you learn the story of the attack on Shechem, Shimon and Levi seinen Gewen Giborem, you must conclude, according to Pshat, that Shimon and Levi were very powerful brothers. Because they went single-handedly, just the 2 of them, and wiped out the entire city of Shechem. So if I know that information, by the time I get to Vayigash, I know I've always learned that Shimon and Levi are powerful, and that's why I learned that Yosef separates Shimon because he knows how much damage they could do. And Rashi's already told us that he listens to his Gevia, and he says, I know that how powerful you people are, you are a threat to our nation because 2 of you destroyed the whole of Shechem. So we now know Shimon and Levi as Giborim. So now the first explanation says that the names that Moshe does not repeat in V'zos HaBracha are weak. That includes Shimon and Levi. Whoa, hang on a second. Why would you think Shimon and Levi are not mentioned twice by Moshe because they're weak when I know that they're strong? The Rebbe brings Rashi den Pirish, therefore Rashi says the what? That's why he tells us straight away those that Moshe repeated their names are actually fundamentally weak. And therefore that tells you that Shimon and Levi are the strong ones. Moshe didn't have to repeat their names. What's the first explanation Rashi gives? That when you repeat their names, it means that they're weak and they need the strength. Shimon and Levi, the names are not repeated. Why? Because they're actually strong. Rashi has to bring that explanation too. The Bai moves Rashi up about Von and Moshe sign. The only thing is that raises another question. What about Yehuda? Yehuda, according to you, Rashi, you're going now with this opinion that says that when Moshe repeats their names, it's because they're weak. Well, Yehuda's name is repeated, and he clearly is a Gibor. So Rashi has to explain. The fact that Yehuda's name was repeated in the brachos of Moshe, it's not it has nothing to do with weakness. There's another independent reason, and we can explore that reason when we get to V'zos HaBracha. Because one thing is for sure, just as we know that Shimon and Levi, based on our learning of Chumash up until this point, must have been strong in our minds, Yehuda definitely is strong. As Yehuda is given zwischen die Giborim, we'll prove it. Not only was he one of the strong brothers, he must be the strongest of the brothers. We'll prove it. Number one, hat sich eingestellt für Binyamin. He was the one who was willing to take the responsibility of Binyamin. You have to be powerful if you're going to take that responsibility to ensure he comes back alive. And hat sich gegengestellt, Yosef and the Mishnah Melech from Mitzrayim b'chulen. He had the boldness to stand up against the most powerful man in the world at the time, not knowing it's his brother Yosef. Incredibly powerful. So therefore, we'd have to say that those who have their names repeated are generally weak, except for Yehuda. Shimon and Levi, their names are not repeated because they're strong. But this explanation also has a weakness. Because, according to this explanation, as Binyamin is given zwischen die Gebäude, that would put Binyamin as one of the strong brothers. Doesn't need to have his name repeated. Now, Binyamin is a strong brother. In the same way as we've learned Chumash up until this point, which gave us the picture that Shimon and Levi are strong, and that Yehuda is strong, that same study of Chumash made us feel that Binyamin is not. Is given the Inkster. He was the youngest of the brothers, at this point, going in front of Pharaoh. And he is referred to as a child born to his parents in old age, who is somewhat, maybe if you want to say, mollycoddled. And Yaakov he's the one child that Yaakov was most afraid of, that some accident might happen to him. From Yosef, and even the negotiation or argument that Yehuda uses against Yosef to release Binyamin, all seem to indicate that Binyamin is not strong enough to stand up for himself. So what would that explain? That would explain the second commentary is those names that are repeated are the names of the brothers who need the strength. But we have a question why Binyamin is not one of those. Deswegen is der erste Pirish der Pirish ha'ikri. Now, in spite of the fact that this is very compelling because we know Shimon and Levi to be strong, and we know Yehuda to be strong, so we can explain why his name is repeated, and that sounds very compelling, still the first explanation, which is that Moshe repeated the names of the strong brothers, is actually a better explanation, and that's why Rashi puts it first. Warum? Leuten zweiten Pirish is Heinemes, as das was Jude is in Klau von die was Kopf von Moshe Shmoisam. Because if I go with the second explanation and I say, why does Yehuda have his name repeated? It's not because of weakness. It's a tzilib at zweiten time for some other reason, nicht mishum chalishus, not because he's lacking. Over Mele bleibt dat Zoll von Chamisha Shvatim, which leaves us with a total of 5 tribes. Befrat leit der Adgosh von Rashi in V'zei Sabrocha, Chamisha Shvatim shebeirach ba'achroina. As Rashi highlights in V'zoi Sabrocha, it's not just 5 Shvatim, but the second group of Shvatim, the later Shvatim. Where Moshe would have repeated their names to give them strength. Seinen aber vor die chamische Shvatim nicht ausgeteilt in an Eifen Boror. So if I'm going to go with that explanation which says Moshe doubled the names of the weaker Shvatim, the truth is I won't have a clear picture. Because Yehuda's name is repeated. So now I have to start remembering in my head, okay, Yehuda is one of the repeated names, but he's not one of the weak brothers. The others are the weak brothers. It's not so clear. The first and therefore the first explanation, which is that Moshe repeats the names of the strong brothers, is actually more sound, because it gives us a clearer picture. Because then I know the 5 whose names are not repeated, they're the weak ones. It's clear. I don't have to extrapolate and say, no, Yehuda's got a different reason. It's very clear. What about Shimon and Levi? If you're going to say that the names that Moshe repeats are the names of the strong brothers, are Shimon and Levi not strong? Because the first explanation leaves Shimon and Levi in the weak brothers, which is really surprising to us. We can explain that. As an Chanamis is given Chaloshim, Shimon and Levi actually were weaker brothers. How then did they take on the whole city of Shechem? You'll be surprised what people will do when you touch their family. The fact that they killed all the inhabitants of Shechem, including the leadership, is not because of how strong they were, nor es hat gewirkt, das was sie haben gefühlt auf sich als die Älteste. They felt a responsibility. Something terrible happened to our family. We're the oldest. Der Achrayas von Nekommen nehmend Farhachzoina Yases Achisenu. We're the ones who have to take revenge against the way that our sister was treated like a Zoina. They look at Reuven. He is the oldest. He's doing nothing. We're next in line. We have to react. It's not a matter of because we're strong. It's because it's right. Especially when you consider that they had a great strategy that weakened the force of the people of Shechem. So they weren't fighting a powerful enemy. So they were angry as well. So all of these factors come together that tells us they're not necessarily strong people. They reacted in a strong way at that time. So now we get it. Rashi, in his explanation of Vayigash, where we don't know which of the brothers who were the strong and the weak, is more inclined to say that the weak brothers are the ones whose names are not repeated by Moshe, and the strong brothers were. Because there's some question around that, no, Shimon and Levi, you really think they're not so powerful? That's why he brings us a second opinion, which is, okay, so the ones whose names were repeated were the weak ones who needed extra strength, and Yehuda is an exception. That would explain why Rashi leaves us here with two views in Vayigash. Why then in V'zois HaBrocha does he seem to be really clear about who it is? That Moshe emboldened or bolstered the weaker brothers or weaker tribes by repeating their names. V'zois HaBrocha, when you get to V'zois HaBrocha, is from Pashtus Aksuvim Mashma. The simple understanding of the Psukim indicates as Divos Kofal Shmoisim Zainen Es Di Chaloshim. Onit Fakert. The simple understanding in context is that when Moshe is blessing Shvatim, not the same as when Yosef is lining up his brothers in front of Pharaoh. When Moshe is blessing Shvatim, he wants to give more bracha to those who need more bracha. And just to understand that, let's dig into the logic of the two explanations, the Medrash and the Gemara, whether it's that Moshe repeats the names of those who are stronger or he repeats the names of those who are weaker. And there's a logical explanation for both. Is it giving strength or is it giving recognition? When we analyze whether Moshe repeating their names is a sign of their strength or weakness. Okay, let's go first with the idea that they're weak ones. That's who Moshe repeats their names. What's the logic? If we're going to go with the logic which says that Moshe repeated the names dafka of those who were weak, so why then would Moshe repeat their names? To give them extra bracha. Like Rashi says right there in to make them stronger. Because they were weak, they needed Moshe to boost them. What's the logic for the other side? And if you're going to say Moshe repeated the names of those who were the strong brothers, what would the logic for that be? Is the Pirish and them, the explanation is because they were strong brothers, they were considered in a sense more important. Because they were considered more important, their name was repeated more. Their names were heard on people's lips more than the other brothers because they made an impression, because they were powerful, because they were leaders. May be similar to the fact that Hashem promised Avram Avinu that he would make his name great, which means people would always refer to him by name. Like Rashi says, when Hashem calls to Avram, Avraham, he repeats his name. Why? To show how beloved Avram Avinu is to him. That's why he repeats his name. Rashi doesn't even have to explain that because it's so obvious. When somebody is dear to you and somebody's a big impact person, you talk about them more. So the logic to say that Moshe repeated the names of the weak brothers is because they needed the help. The logic to say he repeated the names of the strong brothers is because it's natural that when somebody is that strong and powerful and impactful, you talk more about them. Now let's translate that specifically into the brachas that Moshe gave. The chilek zwischen zei b'shaychas to brachas Moshe gufa, specifically in the brachas of V'zois HaBrocha. Leiten pirish as the kefil shmei sachaloshim is silvateisvis bracha. If we go with the first opinion, which is they're weak and they need extra bracha, is moving as das was Moshe ben hat kefil given zer shemos. That would explain then why is Moshe repeating their names. It's part of the bracha. How do you give a bracha to a weaker person? By repeating their name. That's part of the bracha. Aber Leuten Pirish, as die Geberim sein gewähnen, die was Kofar Shmoisam, but if you're going to go with the logic which says Moshe would repeat the names of those who already have a name, who are already strong, it's a Keifel Hashem nit kechelik from Birchas Moshe. Then you have to ask, one second, but repeating the name is now no longer the Brocha. You're talking about something else. The Namen von the Geberim werden nicht übergechazet durch Moshe Rabbeinu l'shem Tosfos Brocha. Moshe is not repeating their names in order to double the amount of Brocha he shares with them. No, the monendig zeir nemen is the Torah. In the Torah is as a keifel amat geschmerzt lib zeir pirsum shmoi heilig lefonav. It must be a side issue that the Torah, once it speaks about these strong brothers, says, do you know who they are? These are these strong brothers. Kind of elevates their profile in our eyes. But Pizah is moving. That helps us to understand. If you learn Vazois HaBrocha at the simplest level of understanding, or specifically the psukim that are part of Moshe's Brocha, is mer mistaver as jeder Wort was steht bei die Brochas von die Shvatim is a Chelek von Birchas Moshe. It's much more logical to say that all of the words that are in the paragraphs of Moshe's Brochas are part of his Brochas. That's much more logical than to say it's Moshe's Brochas with commentary by the Torah. Wow, do you see how great these people are? Und der Rebbe lernt dort Rashi as dos ein gewöhnlich haloshim. That's why in that context it makes sense for Rashi to say that these are the weaker Shvatim. And therefore in the brocha that Moshe is giving them, he repeats their name to give them more strength, because it fits beautifully to say that repeating their name is part of the brocha. No contradiction. Here in Vayigash we're talking about the actual brothers, and which of them are weaker, who would then be put in front of Pharaoh. And then there's a debate who those five are. In Vazois HaBrocha, you're talking about the Shvatim. It's clear who the five Shvatim are that are weaker in Pshat, because in Pshat, they're the ones who need extra brocha. So look for who Moshe is giving extra brocha. With that in mind, we can go and understand all these nuances of what Rashi had to say. Bereshis Rabbi is Agodas Eretz Yisrael, and Talmud Bavli Shelonu, and the Bryce of the Sifri. Like them, but Melech Fashtein, was Rashi is Moshe Pashaseni, she Agodas Eretz Yisrael. Now we understand why Rashi made the distinction between not just the two sources, a Medrash and a Gemara, but the emphasis that the Medrash is the thinking of Eretz Yisrael and the Gemara is the thinking of Bavel, because the thinking of Eretz Yisrael, or the way that Torah is taught in Eretz Yisrael, is succinct, and the way that Torah is taught in Bavel is elaborate, and that's relevant to the conversation. Knowing who said what helps us to understand why they said it. The Unterschied zwischen dem Limud in Eretz Yisrael Talmud Yerushalmi und dem Limud Talmud Bavli. So what's the big distinguishing factor between Talmud Yerushalmi and Bavli? The Eretz Yisrael way of learning and the Bavel way of learning. The Seder Limud in Eretz Yisrael is beteichen besignen kotzer. We know that everything that is taught in Eretz Yisrael, Mishnah, Talmud Yerushalmi, is short and to the point, succinct. Without getting into all the back and forth of understanding the backstory behind this particular ruling, and without very elaborate language. Like the Gemara says, I know that this Tana must be an Eretz Yisrael Tana because of the way he speaks. It's very, so to speak, it's not elaborate. Kelila, he uses few words. In Gemara Bavlis. But how do you learn Torah in Bavel in the methodology of Talmud Bavli? Is with a tremendous amount of detail. There's a lot of detail around the how you come to understand and conclude and what the backstory is and the opinions and how you resolve the opinions. And also in the language itself, the language is more elaborate. So if you're looking in the Medrash, which is the Eretz Yisrael approach, what is their attitude? As when you come to analyze whose names are repeated, is it the weak people whose names are repeated? As Moshe and you want to say it's because they're weaker and they need more brocha, and that's why Moshe repeats their names. Why? Because the attitude is you always usually speak succinctly. And davening can be kept short, and brachas can be kept short. Or if you want to say that Moshe repeated their names because he wanted to keep everything as brief as possible, in other words, it's not that the bracha is brief and then you add the names, but rather keep everything brief. Because what are you going to say? The bracha itself is succinct. The repeating of the words. I've gotten the bracha across in the shortest way possible, and now I'm giving another lesson also in the shortest way possible by adding names and saying, you see how great they are? So if I'm learning the attitude and the approach of Talmud Yerushalmi, which is you keep everything as short as you possibly can, you have to then say that he said the bracha in the shortest way possible. And Moshe did not repeat the names of the weak brothers. Why did he repeat names? To give us in the shortest way possible other information. That he repeated the names of the powerful brothers, that you would then know they are the powerful brothers. But when you go from the attitude of the Talmud Bavli, following the methodology of learning, which is common in Bavel, that if you want to add more information, you have to use more language. Then you have to conclude, as Kof al Moshe Shmoisam, why would Moshe repeat their names? It would have to be because Moshe wanted to add more bracha to the weaker people. How do you add more? You say more words to give more explanation, more clarity, or in this case, more bracha. Moshe added words to their bracha to give them more strength, because that's the way you do it in Bavli. You add more information, you add more words. I'll say, but you could have made it a short bracha and it would be as impactful. Because by repeating their names, he is repeating or doubling the impact and the bracha and the strength that he's giving them. If you think the logic of Bavli, that's how Moshe would have done it. He would have used more words to give more clarity. So, Talmud Yerushalmi or the Medrash keep things short, to the brachas as short as possible. If you're adding words, it's for another whole different reason, to add something else which is a detail. Short, but powerful. They're strong people. If you're Talmud Bavli, you add more words because you're trying to add more bracha, more insight, more strength in this particular case. And finally, then we can explain why Rashi also then quotes not just the Sifri, but tells us it's a Braisa within the Sifri, and not only that, he tells us it's in V'zoisa Bracha. Because von Kol Anal Kumteis, based on everything we've now explained, we can understand as in Jeden von die zwei Perushim is dort zweien dike Yisren agabe dem zweiten Pirush. This is beautiful. Each one of the two explanations, the Medrash or the Gemara, has two advantages over the other. One advantage will relate to how we're learning Parshas Vayigash. And one advantage will be how we understand which names were repeated by Moshe in V'zoisa Bracha. So let's go with the first explanation, which is that he repeats the names of the strong brothers. So the double value of the first explanation is Aleph. Was lefi amuvim from Pshutei Shal Mikra Do is Binyamin given von die Chaloshim und Yehuda von die Giborim. Well, if he repeats the names of the strong brothers, it makes sense. He doesn't repeat Binyamin's name, and he does repeat Yehuda's name. Makes sense. Strong brothers. Second of all, in our Parsha Vayigash, when it says that Yosef separated 5 brothers to take in front of Pharaoh, and we don't know who the 5 are, so we understand he's probably going to take the 5 weaker brothers. He's talking about mispah von die 5 anoshim shvatim kenal. And how do I know who they are? I'll go have a look, and I see who are the names that Moshe did not repeat. They're the weak brothers, and I know clearly that they're 5. So the advantage is Yehuda comes out strong, and I have a clarity that they're 5 exact brothers who are chaloshim, and I don't have to have this whole rigmarole of saying Yehuda's name was doubled, but he's not really weak. Those are the 2 advantages to the first explanation. What are the 2 advantages to saying that the ones that Moshe repeated are the weak brothers? The Yisrin Kofel in Sveit and Pirish, 2 advantages there too. Aleph, wie es ist moving von im Pshute shel Mikra sein Shimon v'Levi given von the Giborim und nicht von the Chaloshim. Well, if I say that he repeated the names of those who are the weak brothers, so then Shimon and Levi don't have their names repeated. That makes sense because they're strong brothers. Big advantage. Base is mer mistaver as achpolas Hashem is in a brocha is an inyan was hat a kesher to the etzem brocha. Logically, if you're giving a brocha and while you're giving the brocha, you repeat somebody's name, logically that must be because you want to grow their brocha, which would be bishvil chazkom chule, which would be logically because you want to strengthen them. Which would make a lot more sense than trying to suggest that the Torah, that Moshe Rabbeinu, in the middle of giving a bracha, says, oh, and I'll also tell you some other sidebar information. Those are the strong guys. Which is not information that is relevant at the time of giving a bracha. In fact, the best time to talk about how great they are would be when you're talking about how great they are, not when you're blessing them. To highlight that point, that when you're giving a bracha, it makes sense that you'd add to the bracha. That's what Rashi wants to highlight by telling us not only is this in the Gemara, it's in the Sifri as well. So what does he say? He brings the Sifri and he says, he tells us that the Sifri, commenting on V'zois HaBracha, says the same as our Gemara says about here in Vayigash. The fact that he says it's in V'zois HaBracha is to remind us that it makes the most sense that in a bracha, you're adding the bracha by repeating the names, not telling us some side detail about how great the brothers are. Und geschehen wie in der ersten 2 Pirushim ist Rashi matin dem Chiluk zwischen Zere Shittas durch Mosef sein Shehagodas Eretz Yisrael B'Gemara Bavle Shelonu. And now we already saw that with the first 2 explanations, Rashi wanted to say, okay, that's Medrash, which thinks like Eretz Yisrael and therefore wants to keep everything succinct and get it more information in fewer words, compared to Talmud Bavli, which wants to take a single idea and explain it in as many words as possible. So Rashi's illustrated the 2 different ways of learning. In a similar way, Rashi keeps the same theme by telling us it's not just in the Sifri, it's a Brisa quoted in the Sifri. Why? As we know, whatever is in a Brisa is built on information that already exists in the Mishnah. But with a very clear distinction. As in the Mishnah is das bekitzur of a remes. Mishnah tells us everything very briefly, and sometimes even just alluding to information that it doesn't spell out. Like the Rambam calls it, davar kotzer v'kelel in yonim rabim, that the Mishnah is short information that contains huge information. When in the Brisa is das meferish barichos ubeprotius, whereas a Brisa unpacks and adds much more detail. On their meat is Rashi Merames. That's what Rashi wants to allude to. As the Derech Hasidir in Brisa Barichus is Masbir or Matin was the Brisa to Sifri land read the Gemara Bavli. The fact that the Sifri is quoting a Brisa, where the job of a Brisa is similar to Talmud Bavli, to add information and to explain it in more detail, that supports the opinion of Gemara Bavli. That which names did Moshe repeat? The names of the weaker brothers, or the weaker Shvatim. As we already explained, why does he add more words, say their names again? To give more to them, to give them strength. But it still only comes in as the second explanation in our parasha, even though for V'zois HaBracha it makes so much sense. In our parasha, it's the second explanation. For a Moterius von Zweiten Pirush is because Shaykh dort wo seret sich wegen Bracha in V'zois HaBracha, because the strength of the second explanation is most pronounced when you're discussing the nature of Moshe's bracha to the Shvatim, which is in V'zois HaBracha. Mashenken pshita shel mikra b'pasha seinu hat merot yusin in the Eshen Pirish Canal. Whereas if you're going to understand our Parasha Vayigash, it actually makes more sense to say that the 5 weaker brothers are not the ones who have their names repeated, because that would fit more neatly into the story of how we understand the nature of the brothers and their strengths and weaknesses at that point in time before they become the Shvatim and before they are blessed by Moshe Rabbeinu.